Why we think about Rome at all. When people say they keep thinking about the Roman Empire, they usually misunderstand what is actually happening. It sounds as if they are talking about memory, education, or interest in history. In reality, the process has very little to do with remembering. What is happening is orientation. History, in this context, is not used as a collection of facts, but as a navigational tool. Human cognition relies on patterns far more than on precise information. When the present becomes difficult to interpret and the future stops forming clear images, the mind instinctively turns backward, not to search for answers, but to locate configurations that once felt coherent. This is not a cultural habit and not an intellectual choice. It is a basic cognitive response to uncertainty. People rarely decide consciously to think about Rome. They do not sit down and choose the Roman Empire as a topic of reflection. Thoughts of Rome appear indirectly, as comparisons, metaphors, background associations, or half-formed images that surface before a clear question has even been articulated. This is a sign that the mind is searching for structural familiarity. When reality becomes too complex to analyze directly, cognition shifts from explanation to comparison. It looks for something that has already existed and that feels structurally similar, even if the surface details are different. In this sense, history functions less like a record and more like a storage of usable forms. We do not turn to the past for accuracy, we turn to it for recognizability. What matters is not what exactly happened, but how it felt to live inside a system that was no longer fully intelligible to the people within it. Rome, in this role, is no longer a specific historical object. It becomes an abstract model, a symbolic configuration that represents a particular condition of society. It is crucial to understand that most people who think about Rome know very little about it in concrete terms. This does not weaken the model. It strengthens it. The fewer details a historical image contains, the more easily it can function as a cognitive tool. Rome in popular consciousness is not a sequence of emperors, reforms, or battles. It is the impression of a vast system that once made sense, that once had direction, and that later continued to exist largely through inertia. That impression is enough. Modern individuals live inside systems that continue to operate even when their purpose is no longer clear. Institutions persist, procedures repeat themselves, decisions are made, and outcomes are enforced, but the underlying sense of direction becomes increasingly difficult to articulate. When this happens, the mind looks for precedent. Not to predict collapse, but to confirm that such a condition is possible at all. Rome provides that confirmation. It demonstrates that a society can retain laws, administration, infrastructure, and everyday routines while simultaneously losing coherence. It shows that decay does not need to announce itself as disaster. It can appear as continuity. That realization is unsettling, but it is also stabilizing, because it frames confusion as a recognizable historical condition rather than a unique failure of the present. This is why Rome emerges at moments of collective uncertainty. It is not an object of fascination, but a symptom. A sign that contemporary consciousness is struggling to describe its own environment using present-day language. When the vocabulary of the present fails, the mind borrows the vocabulary of the past. Rome becomes useful not because it was exceptional, but because it was familiar enough for modern cognition to recognize itself within it. At this level, Rome is not yet history and not yet an example. It functions as a cognitive crutch, a way to preserve orientation when existing explanations no longer hold. That is why it appears repeatedly, even when no one intends to think about it at all. Why Rome, and not any other civilization? Once it becomes clear that thinking about Rome is not about history but about orientation, the next obvious question emerges: why Rome specifically? Human history offers no shortage of collapsed civilizations. Many of them were larger, older, more violent, more mysterious, or more technologically impressive relative to their time. If the mind is simply searching for a past example of decline or instability, Rome should not be the default reference. And yet, it is. This persistence is not accidental. Rome occupies a very narrow and unusual position in the historical imagination, one that no other civilization fully shares. Earlier civilizations fail to function as cognitive models because their internal logic does not translate into modern intuition. Ancient Egypt, for example, is inseparable from theology. Its political authority is derived from divine kingship, ritual continuity, and cosmic order. Power in Egypt does not appear as administration in the modern sense, it appears as sacred maintenance of balance. Even when Egypt declines, the decline is framed symbolically, not procedurally. This makes it difficult for modern minds to map their own experience onto it. The structure is too alien. Mesopotamian empires face a similar problem. Law is divine command. Authority is mythic. Human agency is secondary to the will of the gods. The state is not something that operates through neutral systems, but through cosmological legitimacy. For modern cognition, which experiences power as impersonal and bureaucratic, this framework is too distant to feel applicable. It cannot easily be inhabited as a mental simulation. Bronze Age civilizations are even less usable. Their collapse feels abrupt, mysterious, and externally driven. They vanish into gaps in the historical record. This makes them fascinating, but not instructive. They feel like puzzles rather than precedents. Modern minds cannot easily imagine living inside their final years because so little of their internal logic survives in a recognizable form. Later empires, paradoxically, are also less effective models. Medieval kingdoms are bound to feudal loyalty, religious authority, and personal obligation. Early modern empires operate through colonial dynamics that do not resemble the lived experience of most contemporary citizens. Even modern imperial structures are too close to the present. They are politically charged, morally loaded, and emotionally unstable as reference points. They provoke argument rather than reflection. Rome sits in a narrow gap between myth and modernity. It is ancient enough to feel safe, but structured enough to feel familiar. Its power does not rely primarily on divine mystery, but on organization. Roads, taxation, military logistics, legal codification, census taking, provincial administration, these are not symbolic gestures. They are functional systems. They resemble the mechanisms through which modern states operate. This procedural nature is critical. Rome feels like a machine rather than a myth. You can imagine how it worked without needing to believe in its gods. You can understand its authority without subscribing to its cosmology. This makes Rome uniquely transferable as a mental model. It can be stripped of its religious and cultural specifics and still remain intelligible. Rome is also the first civilization where decline appears as internal degradation rather than external annihilation. Earlier societies tend to vanish when they fall. Rome lingers. It fragments, transforms, rebrands, and persists. Its institutions mutate rather than disappear. Roman law survives long after Roman power fades. Roman identity continues even when Roman control no longer exists. People keep calling themselves Romans long after the system that defined that identity has hollowed out. This lingering quality is essential. Rome does not end cleanly. It dissolves slowly, unevenly, and without consensus. That process feels disturbingly familiar to modern societies, which also experience change as gradual reconfiguration rather than rupture. Another reason Rome dominates the imagination is scale combined with intimacy. Rome governed enormous territories, yet its mechanisms were simple enough to grasp. A tax collector, a governor, a legion, a road, a decree. These are not abstract concepts. They are human-scale components. You can imagine yourself inside them. You can imagine being governed by them. That imagination is much harder with civilizations whose power structures are opaque or symbolic. Finally, Rome offers a version of decline that does not rely on moral condemnation. It does not require the observer to believe that people became worse, lazier, or more corrupt. Rome declines despite competence, despite reform attempts, despite intelligence. That makes it an unsettling but honest mirror. It suggests that systems can fail structurally, not because of vice, but because they outgrow their own capacity for adaptation. This combination, procedural power, internal legibility, slow decay, and moral neutrality, makes Rome uniquely usable as a mental reference point. No other civilization occupies this exact position. Others are either too alien, too mythic, too morally charged, or too politically close to function in the same way. That is why, when the mind searches for a historical pattern that resembles modern complexity, it returns to Rome. Not because Rome was exceptional in every sense, but because it was ordinary enough to feel real, and structured enough to feel familiar. Rome becomes the default not by accident, but by elimination. It is the only past system that modern cognition can inhabit without translation. Rome as a procedural empire. What ultimately makes Rome feel familiar is not its culture, its art, or its mythology, but the way power was organized and exercised. Rome does not present itself as a civilization held together by revelation or destiny. It presents itself as a system that functions through procedure. This distinction is crucial, because modern people do not experience power as sacred or heroic. They experience it as administrative. Forms, permits, regulations, infrastructure, enforcement, and compliance are the dominant interfaces through which authority appears today. Rome is the first large-scale civilization where power takes this shape clearly enough to be recognizable without explanation. Roman authority expressed itself through mechanisms rather than symbols. Roads were not monuments, they were tools. They allowed legions to move, taxes to be collected, messages to travel, and control to be maintained over distance. Law was not a divine code handed down from the gods, it was a practical framework designed to standardize behavior across vast territories. The army was not merely a warrior caste, it was a disciplined, bureaucratic institution with ranks, payrolls, supply chains, and rotation schedules. Governance was not localized mythic rule, it was delegated through governors, magistrates, census officials, and tax collectors. This matters because procedural systems scale. They do not rely on belief or charisma. They rely on repetition. Once established, they can continue operating even when enthusiasm fades. This is one of Rome's greatest strengths during its expansion, and one of its most haunting features during its decline. The machine keeps running. Modern individuals recognize this immediately because their own lives are shaped by similar dynamics. You do not need to believe in the legitimacy of the system for it to function. You only need to participate in it. Rome understood this early. Compliance did not depend on loyalty to an idea, it depended on integration into process. Pay taxes, follow laws, accept census registration, serve when required. Participation itself reinforced the system. Rome also standardized reality. Provinces were reorganized to fit Roman administrative logic. Local customs were tolerated only insofar as they did not interfere with taxation, order, and military readiness. This created a unified operational environment across enormous geographic and cultural distances. To the modern mind, this resembles the way contemporary states harmonize regulations, measurements, documentation, and legal categories. The content may differ, but the logic is the same. Another defining feature of Rome's procedural nature is impersonality. Authority did not depend on knowing the ruler personally. It depended on recognizing the office. A governor could change, but the governorship remained. An emperor could die, but imperial administration continued. Power resided less in individuals than in roles. This shift is fundamental. Once power becomes embedded in roles, it becomes durable. It can survive incompetence, indifference, and even hostility. This impersonality also changes how people relate to power psychologically. When authority is personal, conflict is emotional and direct. When authority is procedural, conflict becomes abstract. You are not opposing a person, you are navigating a system. Rome trained its subjects to think this way long before modern bureaucracies perfected it. This procedural logic also reshaped responsibility. Decisions were rarely framed as moral choices. They were framed as obligations, requirements, or necessities. An official did not act because they wanted to, but because the procedure demanded it. This framing reduces friction. It also dilutes accountability. When everyone is following procedure, no one feels fully responsible for outcomes. This is another reason Rome feels modern. Contemporary systems operate on the same principle. Decisions are justified as compliance rather than intention. Outcomes are described as results of process rather than choice. Rome normalized this mode of governance at scale. Crucially, procedural systems do not collapse easily. They degrade. They become inefficient, rigid, and misaligned, but they persist. The very features that make them stable during growth make them resistant to reform during decline. Rome's procedures continued long after they stopped producing the stability they were designed to ensure. This creates a specific kind of decay. Not dramatic failure, but increasing friction. More rules are required to enforce compliance. More oversight is needed to correct inefficiency. More resources are consumed simply to maintain operations. The system becomes heavier without becoming more effective. Modern societies recognize this sensation instinctively. It is the feeling of living inside a structure that still functions, but no longer feels purposeful. Rome provides the earliest and clearest historical example of this condition at scale. At this point, Rome is no longer just familiar. It becomes instructive. It shows that procedural power does not need belief to survive, only participation. And it shows that once a system reaches a certain level of complexity, it can continue operating even as the reasons for its existence fade from view. This procedural continuity is the foundation for everything that follows. It explains why Rome could endure decline without announcing it, why its collapse felt invisible from within, and why modern minds recognize themselves in its machinery. From Roman greatness to Roman decline for most of its history, Rome is remembered as a story of expansion, conquest, engineering, and order. This version of Rome is impressive, but it is not what occupies the modern imagination. People do not return obsessively to Rome because it was powerful. Power alone does not haunt. What haunts is endurance after purpose begins to dissolve. The modern fixation is not on how Rome rose, but on how it failed to end. This shift in focus is important because it reveals what people are actually searching for. Narratives of rise are aspirational. They tell us how things can be built. Narratives of sudden collapse are dramatic. They tell us how things can be destroyed. Rome offers something different. It offers a narrative of prolonged decline that does not resolve itself cleanly. That ambiguity is precisely what makes it compelling. Rome's greatness feels complete. Its rise follows a logic that is easy to summarize: military discipline, administrative innovation, strategic expansion, and legal coherence. It culminates in a recognizable peak. Once that peak is reached, the story becomes predictable. But the decline resists simplification. It does not obey the structure of a tragedy with a clear turning point. Instead, it unfolds as a series of adjustments, compromises, and temporary solutions that slowly become permanent. This is why the decline matters more than the ascent. It is the part of the story where intention and outcome begin to separate. Roman leaders did not decide to dismantle the empire. They tried to preserve it. Reforms were introduced to stabilize finances, secure borders, and maintain order. Each reform made sense in isolation. Each response was rational given the pressure of the moment. And yet, taken together, these responses gradually transformed the empire into something that no longer resembled its original purpose. From the outside, history labels this process as decline. From the inside, it felt like governance under strain. Problems accumulated faster than solutions could resolve them. Emergency measures became routine. Temporary fixes became structural features. The system adapted continuously, but never fully recovered. This is crucial. Rome did not stop responding. It responded constantly. It restructured provinces, reorganized the military, revised tax systems, and redefined citizenship. The empire was not passive in its decay. It was active, but reactive rather than strategic. This distinction matters because it shows that decline is not always the result of neglect. It can be the result of perpetual adjustment without long-term coherence. Modern minds recognize this pattern immediately. We live in systems that are always reforming themselves, always optimizing, always updating, and yet rarely asking whether the original goals still apply. Rome becomes relevant because it demonstrates that activity does not guarantee direction. A system can be extremely busy while slowly losing alignment. Another reason the decline overshadows the rise is that it is the phase in which normal life continues. During Rome's ascent, change is visible and often disruptive. During its decline, continuity dominates. The streets are still there. The offices are still staffed. The laws are still enforced. This makes decline harder to perceive and easier to rationalize. The mind latches onto this because it destabilizes the usual expectation of collapse. People expect endings to be obvious. Rome teaches that endings can be diffuse. They can stretch across generations. They can be experienced not as an event, but as a condition. This reframes how people think about their own time. The question becomes not are we rising or falling, but are we still aligned with what we think we are doing? Rome suggests that loss of alignment can persist indefinitely without producing immediate ruin. That is why the decline, not the glory, becomes the dominant image. Glory reassures. Decline unsettles. And Rome's decline unsettles precisely because it does not offer closure. It remains open-ended, gradual, and eerily familiar. At this point in the analysis, Rome stops functioning as a historical example and starts functioning as a psychological reference. It becomes a way to think about endurance without purpose, stability without coherence, and continuity without direction. The rise explains how Rome became powerful. The decline explains why Rome still matters. Rome did not fall. The normalization of decay. The idea that Rome fell is largely a retrospective construction. It is a word imposed by historians looking backward, trying to compress centuries of gradual change into a single, understandable concept. From the inside, Rome did not experience itself as collapsing. It experienced itself as continuing. This difference between external narrative and internal perception is critical, because it explains why Rome remains psychologically disturbing rather than merely educational. For the majority of people living in the later Roman world, daily life did not suddenly stop making sense. Markets still functioned. Laws were still enforced. Offices were still occupied. Armies were still raised. Taxes were still collected. Even when borders shifted and authority weakened, the structure of everyday existence remained largely intact. This continuity masked the deeper transformation taking place beneath the surface. Decay, in Rome, did not announce itself as crisis. It embedded itself into routine. What had once been exceptional gradually became normal. Emergency measures stopped being temporary. They became permanent features of governance. Currency debasement was introduced as a short-term solution and then accepted as standard practice. Military command structures were reorganized repeatedly, not to improve effectiveness, but to cope with chronic instability. Administrative oversight increased to compensate for declining trust and compliance. This process created a society that adjusted continuously to worsening conditions without ever fully acknowledging them as terminal. Each generation inherited a version of Rome that was slightly less coherent than the one before, but that version felt familiar because it was the only one they had known. What historians describe as decline was experienced by individuals as how things are. This is the essence of normalization. When change happens slowly enough, it ceases to be perceived as change at all. Standards shift quietly. Expectations lower incrementally. People adapt not because they are ignorant, but because adaptation is necessary for survival within the system. Rome did not collapse despite this adaptation, it persisted because of it. One of the most striking features of late Roman society is how many people continued to identify as Romans long after Roman institutions had lost effective control. Roman identity outlived Roman power. Titles were retained. Legal terminology persisted. Cultural habits survived. Even when local rulers replaced imperial authority in practice, they often governed in Rome's name. The shell remained long after the core weakened. This persistence of form created a powerful illusion of stability. As long as familiar symbols remained, the absence of underlying coherence was difficult to articulate. The system appeared intact because its external markers were still visible. Decline became something that could be sensed but not easily named. This is why the concept of fall is misleading. A fall implies sudden loss. Rome experienced gradual displacement. Authority slipped from centralized control to local power structures. Economic integration fragmented. Military loyalty shifted. None of this required a dramatic break. It unfolded through accumulation rather than rupture. The normalization of decay also altered how people related to the future. Long-term planning became difficult. Expectations narrowed. Survival replaced ambition. Stability was redefined as the absence of immediate catastrophe rather than the presence of progress. Rome did not disappear, it shrank inward. This inward contraction is one of the most psychologically relevant aspects of Roman decline. The system continued to exist, but its horizon shortened. Governance focused increasingly on managing symptoms rather than shaping outcomes. Maintenance replaced direction. This condition is deeply unsettling because it contradicts the way humans expect systems to end. We imagine collapse as visible failure. Rome shows that systems can persist long after they have stopped functioning in a meaningful sense. They can continue through habit, identity, and administrative inertia. That is why Rome does not feel like a completed story. It feels like an unresolved process. The normalization of decay prevents closure. There is no clear moment where the past ends and something entirely new begins. Instead, there is overlap, ambiguity, and gradual transformation. Rome's greatest psychological impact comes from this ambiguity. It forces us to confront the possibility that decline does not need to be recognized in order to occur. It only needs to become ordinary. Structural exhaustion and the growth of complexity as pressures on the Roman system increased, the empire did not respond by simplifying itself. It responded by becoming more complex. This reaction feels logical at first glance. When problems multiply, the intuitive response is to add structure, oversight, regulation, and control. Rome followed this logic consistently, and that consistency is precisely what led it into structural exhaustion. Economic strain, military threats, political instability, and demographic shifts created continuous stress on imperial administration. Instead of reducing scope or abandoning unmanageable regions, Rome attempted to compensate through management. New offices were created to oversee old ones. Additional layers of bureaucracy were introduced to enforce compliance. Laws multiplied in an effort to regulate behavior that no longer aligned naturally with imperial expectations. Tax systems became more intricate as the state tried to extract diminishing resources from an overburdened population. Each of these measures made sense in isolation. None of them were irrational. Each was designed to solve a specific problem as it appeared. The issue was not incompetence, but accumulation. Every new rule required enforcement. Every new office required funding. Every exception created the need for further clarification. Over time, the system became increasingly focused on managing its own complexity rather than addressing external realities. This produced a form of exhaustion that was not immediately visible. Rome did not run out of ideas. It ran out of flexibility. The administrative apparatus became so dense that meaningful reform threatened to destabilize the very mechanisms holding the empire together. Change became dangerous. Stability, even dysfunctional stability, became preferable to uncertainty. The military illustrates this process clearly. As external threats intensified and internal cohesion weakened, the Roman army became more expensive and less reliable. To compensate, Rome reorganized command structures, altered recruitment practices, and increasingly relied on federated forces. These changes reduced immediate pressure but weakened long-term control. Loyalty shifted from institutions to individuals. Authority became fragmented, but the administrative burden grew heavier. The same pattern appeared in taxation. As economic productivity declined, the state did not reduce its demands. It refined them. Tax categories multiplied. Obligations became hereditary. Enforcement grew harsher. This protected short-term revenue at the cost of long-term legitimacy. The system survived, but the relationship between state and population became increasingly extractive. This is the core of structural exhaustion. The system continues to function, but only by consuming more energy to produce less stability. Its outputs diminish while its maintenance costs increase. At a certain point, the system exists primarily to sustain itself. From within, this does not feel like failure. It feels like permanent crisis management. Officials spend their time responding to emergencies, correcting deviations, and enforcing compliance. Strategic thinking gives way to procedural survival. The horizon narrows. The goal becomes continuity rather than improvement. This condition is particularly dangerous because it hides behind activity. The system appears busy, responsive, and engaged. Reforms are announced. Offices are reorganized. Laws are updated. But these actions operate within a shrinking space of possibility. They address symptoms without touching underlying constraints. Rome demonstrates that complexity is not neutral. It carries weight. Beyond a certain threshold, complexity stops being a tool and becomes a burden. The system loses the ability to adapt because adaptation itself would require dismantling parts of the structure that now sustain it. This is why Rome did not experience a decisive moment of reform. Any attempt to radically simplify governance risked immediate collapse. The empire became trapped by its own mechanisms. It could not easily move forward, but it could not step back. Structural exhaustion is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It manifests as fatigue, rigidity, and risk aversion. Decisions become defensive. Innovation slows. Preservation replaces purpose. Rome's significance lies in showing that collapse does not require sudden failure. It can emerge from a system's success in managing itself beyond its capacity to remain meaningful. This dynamic is essential to understanding why Rome feels modern. Many contemporary systems operate under similar conditions. They persist not because they work well, but because they have become too complex to change without causing damage. Rome shows us what happens when complexity becomes destiny.